Picking the wrong focal length can make or break a shot. So are there rules for matching your lens to your subject? Let's talk about it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. On the last episode, I talked about prime lenses versus zooms, and a viewer named Simon Maddox 6777 had a good follow-up comment. It was pretty long, but here's the gist of it. Focal length choice is something that doesn't get talked about enough. Your gear should follow what you're shooting, but that intuition takes time to develop. I'd love to see a video exploring how to match your focal length to your subject. First of all, Simon, thanks for sending that in. I like the pun. Takes time to develop. I see what you did there. But besides that, this is kind of a great topic because focal length is one of those things that a lot of photographers learn just by trial and error over years of shooting. So what I want to do today is help shorten that process and give you a framework for thinking about it, especially if you're just starting out. So let's go ahead and start with this. What is focal length? Well, when light passes through a lens, the glass refracts the incoming rays. That means that it redirects them so they converge on your camera's sensor. The optical center of the lens is a theoretical point inside the lens where that refraction effectively takes place. So focal length is the distance, measured in millimeters, between that optical center and the point where the light converges on the sensor when the lens is focused at infinity. Now that sounds a bit more complicated than it is, but just know that a shorter focal length, which is the lower numbers like 24 millimeters, refracts incoming light more strongly, which gives you a wider angle of view. You can see more of the scene. A longer focal length, which is higher numbers like 200 millimeters, refracts it more gently, which narrows that angle of view. You're seeing less of the scene, but it's essentially magnifying a smaller part of it. Think of it kind of like a garden hose. A wide spray covers a lot of ground, but doesn't really reach very far, whereas a really tight stream goes farther, but only hits a small area. Focal length is kind of similar to that with your field of view. Now, something that tends to get confusing is that focal length and field of view are not actually the same thing. A 50 millimeter prime lens always has a focal length of 50 millimeters, but your field of view, which is the part of the scene that you can actually see, can change using that 50 millimeter lens depending on the size of your camera's sensor. A full frame sensor is roughly the same size as a frame of 35 millimeter film, or about 36 by 24 millimeters. When we talk about focal lengths in general, we're usually referring to the field of view you'll see on a full frame sensor, just because that's what was used for so long on film. But most entry-level cameras and a bunch of mid-range cameras these days use what's called a crop sensor. It's physically smaller than full frame, so it crops in on your image. Now, how much it crops sometimes depends on the camera brand that you're using. On Canon's APS-C cameras, it's 1.6 times. So if you put a 50 millimeter lens on a Canon APS-C body, it's going to give you a field of view equivalent to an 80 millimeter lens on a full frame camera. You just multiply the focal length by 1.6. So a 24 becomes roughly 38 millimeters and a 100 becomes 160 millimeters. Now, other camera brands use slightly different crop factors, like Sony and Nikon, for example. They use a 1.5 times crop. So that 50 millimeters would look more like 75 instead of 80. I know it can be a bit confusing, but it's important to know when you're making decisions about which lens to buy or use. If you're shooting on a crop sensor body, you need to do that quick math based on the focal length of the lens to really understand what field of view you're actually going to get. For the rest of this video, I'm going to use full frame focal lengths just to keep that conversation. So keep that conversion in mind if you're shooting with a crop sensor camera. Okay, so now that we know what focal length is, let's actually see it in action. I took my camera outside here in New York City and I positioned myself across the street from Carnegie Hall. I used zoom lenses to take a series of photos at a bunch of different focal lengths, all from the exact same spot. Now I chose the Canon 11-24 f4, the 24-70 2.8, and the 100-400 4.5 to 5.6. I kept my exposure settings exactly the same for every image because I only wanted to show the difference in field of view. First up is super wide at 11 millimeters. You can see everything. The cars in the street, including a bus that was right in front of the building, and all the way up to the sky at dusk and the tops of other buildings behind the venue. Make a mental note of this area right over the main entrance because we're going to get a lot closer as I zoom in. So then at 14 millimeters, the field of view is a bit more narrow. More at 20 millimeters, and even more at 24 millimeters, where I'm finally not seeing that bus in front of the building. At 35, I'm cutting off the sky. And at 50, and then 70, I'm only seeing a smaller area of the building. Now is where it starts to get fun. Remember that area I pointed out in the 11mm shot? At 100mm, you can read it really well. Here's 135, 200mm, 300mm, and finally 400mm. You remember where we started all this? You couldn't even tell there were words down there, but you can see practically the whole neighborhood. That's the difference between focal lengths of 11mm all the way to 400mm. Hey, quick sidebar. If you've got a photography question you want me to answer, you know what to do. Just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit that form right there on the site. If you want to keep up with everything I'm doing, thedavidbergman.com has links to all of my socials, my free email list, a ton of educational videos, and a few discount and affiliate links. And if you're enjoying this video, please hit like, subscribe to Adorama's YouTube channel, and tap that bell icon for notifications. It really helps us keep making free photography content for you every single week. Okay, so now let's talk about how to actually apply all of this. I'm going to give you my suggestions for focal lengths that work well in some common situations. But keep in mind that there really are no rules here. These are just guidelines based on my own experience. Some of the most iconic photos actually broke every rule in the book. But if you're not sure where to begin, take these as a starting point. First up is landscape and architecture. These are probably the most obvious use case for wide-angle lenses. When you're trying to capture a sweeping vista, a dramatic skyline, or the full facade of a building, you want to see a lot of the scene in your frame. If I had to pick one lens to start with for this type of shooting, I'd probably go with the 24mm. It's wide enough to be genuinely useful for landscapes and architecture, but not so extreme that it's hard to work with. It's a great lens really to learn on. And once you spend some time at 24mm and you want to go wider than that, lenses in the 14 to 20mm range are going to give you something more dramatic and immersive. For architecture specifically, really wide lenses let you get a whole building in the frame, even if you can't back up very far, like when I was across the street at Carnegie Hall. But something to watch out for is distortion. If you tilt the camera up to get the top of a building, the vertical lines are going to converge and the buildings will look like they're leaning into each other. You can correct for some of that in post. Another good lens, though, to use for architecture is a tilt shift to prevent that distortion in the first place. I did a video about using one of those a while back, and I'll put a link in the description below so you can check that out later. Now, weddings and events, those are kind of interesting because they require you to cover a lot of different situations in a single job. You might be shooting a wide establishing shot of a venue 1 minute, and then a tight shot of a CEO or a bride and groom the next. So versatility is really the key here. If I had to pick one lens to start with for this type of work, it'd probably be the 24 to 105mm zoom. It gives you enough width at 24 to capture the whole room and the extra length at 105 to grab candid moments from a little further away without being intrusive. Then if you want to step it up, a lot of wedding and event photographers work with two camera bodies, one with that wide zoom and another with something longer like a 70 to 200. That lets you zoom in and get details like flowers and wedding rings, and it means you won't have to change lenses at a critical moment. Missing the first kiss because you were switching lenses is not going to make a good impression with the happy couple. Now, street photography is where the rules kind of start to break down, and that's part of what makes it so fun. The popular focal length for street photography, in my opinion, is probably 35mm. It's wide enough to show some environment and context around your subject, but not so wide that you're distorting faces or exaggerating distances. It feels natural and immediate, which kind of suits the spontaneous nature of street shooting. A 50mm is another classic choice. It's a little more neutral than the 35, and because it's close to what our eyes see naturally, pictures shot at 50mm tend to feel sort of honest. A lot of legendary street photographers worked almost exclusively at 50mm. Now, if you prefer to keep your distance and observe without being noticed, a short telephoto in that 85 to 135mm range lets you stay back a bit and still fill the frame with your subject. You do lose some of that environmental context, but you gain the ability to capture more candid, unguarded moments. The real answer for street photography is that the best focal length is the one that you're most comfortable shooting with. Because when you're comfortable with the lens, you know what you're going to get before you start shooting, and you're really not thinking about it, and it helps you to pay attention to what's happening in front of you. That's really when the great shots happen. Now, for portraits, the sweet spot is generally somewhere in the 85 to 135 range. These focal lengths are flattering to facial features because they don't distort proportions a way that a wider lens can. If you get too close with a 24mm, your subject's nose is going to look a lot bigger than it probably should. If I had to pick one starting lens for portraits, I'd go with an 85. It gives you a comfortable working distance from your subject, which helps them to relax, and it's long enough to start getting some nice background separation. Even at the same aperture, longer focal lengths produce a shallower depth of field than shorter ones, so an 85mm is going to blur the background more than a 50mm at the same f-stop. Now, if you want even more background blur and a more compressed look, try 135mm. It does require you to back up a bit more, so you make sure you have space to work, but the results can be pretty darn cool. Now finally, sports, action, and wildlife, those are where long focal lengths really come into play. When you can't get close to your subject, whether that's a wide receiver running a route in the middle of the field, or it's a bird in flight or a lion in the savannah, you need the reach that only a long lens can give you. If I had to pick one starting lens for this type of shooting without necessarily breaking the bank, I'd go with a 70 to 200mm zoom. It's versatile enough to handle a wide range of situations, and at 200mm you've got enough reach to capture a subject that's still kind of far away. If you want even more reach, a 100 to 500mm or a 200 to 800 is going to get you there. These are relatively lightweight lenses considering the massive focal lengths that they give you, and they're going to help to isolate a single athlete from across the field or a bird across the lake. And then if money is no object, or if you're just a working professional on the sidelines at the Super Bowl, you're going to be using something like Canon's RF 100-300 f2.8 and maybe a 400-2.8 or a 600 f4 prime lens. These are big and heavy lenses that cost over $10,000 each, but when used properly, they can help you get that game-winning shot no matter where it happens on the field. So yes, long lenses dominate action and sports photography, but as I said earlier, there are really no rules for this. Some of the most iconic sports photos ever made were shot with wide-angle lenses. Showing the whole scene at 24mm can be just as powerful as a tight shot at 400mm. So those are my focal length suggestions for some common shooting situations, but I was also kind of curious about what focal lengths I use the most when shooting concerts. So I went back and looked at my best photos from my work with Luke Combs over the last 7 years. Out of 1,109 of my favorite images, 461 were shot in the 24 to 35mm range, and 64 images were shot from 400 to 500mm. That means almost half of my best work was at the two extremes of the focal length spectrum. That's partly because the two lenses I use most of the time are the Canon RF 24 to 105 f4 and the RF 100 to 500 4.5 to 7.1. I shoot wide when I'm up close in the pit, and also from the upper decks to make epic wide shots of the arena or stadium. And then I zoom all the way in when I want tight detail shots or when I'm standing further back and want to get closer to the action. Look, if you're just starting out and want to develop your own style, pick a single focal length like 50mm and just live with it for a while. Force yourself to work within that constraint. You're going to start to see the world differently through that lens, and you'll figure out pretty quickly whether it suits your vision or not, and then you can make adjustments from there. At the end of the day, focal length is just a tool. The most important thing is what you do with it. And the only way to figure that out is to just get out there and shoot. Hey, what focal length do you find yourself reaching for most often? And has that changed over time as you've developed your style? Let me know down in the comments below. And then check out the video that started this discussion where I compare prime versus zoom lenses. I go into a bunch of other reasons besides focal length that you might pick one lens over the other. Thanks so much for watching Adorama TV. I'll see you next time right here on Ask David Bergman.